Good morning everybody and welcome to my channel. Today I will explain about the anatomy of orbit. Okay, so let's start. Orbit is a bony cavities and it contains eyeball. Okay, so from this picture you can easily look out that these are the two bony orbits and these two bony orbits contains two eyeballs. Okay, now the anatomy of orbit starts with the its shape. Okay, so the orbit is quadrangular pyramid in shape, means that the orbit has four sides or four walls, and at the anterior there is a opening, and at posterior these four walls or four sides converge and meet a single point. Okay, this orbit is located in between the anterior cranial fossa above and maxillary air sinuses below, and this orbit is formed by the seven bone. Okay, so what are these seven bones? Look at this picture. So superiorly this is the frontal bone, and posterior superiorly there is the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone. Inferiorly it is the maxillary bone, laterally it is the zygomatic bone, and posterolaterally here it is the greater wing of sphenoid bone, and medially here is the lacrimal bone, and posteriorly somewhat here is the ethmoid bone. Okay, so this is the basics understanding about the orbit. So now we will explain about the different walls of the orbit. So we have just discussed that this shape of the orbit is quadrangular pyramid, so it has the four sides. So in medical terminology these four sides also called as the four walls of the orbit. So these four walls are the roof, floor, medial wall and lateral wall. Okay, now let's see the what are the bones that formed these walls of the orbit. Okay, now the roof of the orbit is formed by the frontal bone anteriorly, and posteriorly it is formed by the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone. So I think you all have a basic idea about the skull bones. What is the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone? What is the frontal bone? What is the temporal bone? Okay. So in this picture, you can easily look out that this is a orbital plate of the frontal bone, which form the anterior part of the orbital roof, and this is the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone, which form the posterior part of the orbital roof. Now we will see what are the other structures that is in relation to this orbital roof. So look at this picture, the anterolateral aspect of this orbital plate of the frontal bone, there is a lacrimal fossa. So this lacrimal fossa contains the lacrimal gland. Okay, and anteromedial aspect of this orbital plate of frontal bone, there is the trochlear fossa. So this trochlear fossa contains the trochlea, means the cartilaginous pulley for the superior oblique muscle. Okay, and this frontal bone separates the orbit from this frontal lobe and cerebrum, and posteriorly at the junction of this roof and lateral wall there is the superior orbital fissure. Okay, so these are the structures which are in relation to this orbital roof, and this orbital roof is formed anteriorly by this orbital plate of frontal bone and posteriorly by the lesser wing of sphenoid bone. Okay, so in our orbit it is the lateral wall, isn't it? So this lateral wall is formed by the zygomatic bone anteriorly, and posteriorly it is formed by the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. Okay, now we will see what are the other structures in relation to this. So this greater wing of the sphenoid bone separates the orbit from the middle cranial fossa, and this zygomatic bone separates the orbit from the temporal fossa. Okay, so always remember that the lateral wall, means this wall, is formed anteriorly by the frontal process of the zygomatic bone and posteriorly by the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. Now this medial wall, so medial wall means this wall towards the nose. So this medial wall is formed by the four bones. So these are the lacrimal bone, the orbital plate of the ethmoid bone, the frontal process of the maxillary bone, and the body of the sphenoid. So from this picture you can look out that here is the lacrimal bone. Okay, and here is the maxillary bone, and between this lacrimal bone and maxillary bone it is the lacrimal groove, and this is the ethmoid bone posteriorly, and here somewhat here it is the body of the sphenoid bone. So these bones are forming the medial wall of the orbit. Now we will see what are the other structures in relation to this. So there is a shallow depression at the frontal process of maxillary bone, and this is nothing but the fossa of the inferior oblique muscle. Okay, and this ethmoid bone separates the orbit from the ethmoidal sinuses. Okay, and at the junction of this roof and medial wall it is the frontoethmoidal suture, where there is the ethmoidal canal located, through which the ethmoidal anterior and posterior ethmoidal nerves passes. Okay, so this is all about the medial wall of the orbit. Now we look at the floor. So the floor of this orbit is mainly formed by the orbital surface of the maxillary bone. So it is the floor. Okay, so this floor is formed by the orbital process of the maxillary bone. Anterolaterally, it is formed by the zygomatic bone through this side, and posterolaterally, it is formed by the palatine bone. So now look at this picture. So this is the floor of the orbit. This is the orbital process of the maxillary bone. Okay, so this forms the main part of this orbital floor. And anterolaterally, it is a zygomatic bone, and posteriorly, it is formed by this palatine bone. Okay, so these are the ethmoid air sinuses, and this is the inferior orbital fissure. Okay, so this is all about these walls of the orbit. Now we will learn about the base of the orbit. So what is the base of the orbit? So in our previous slide, we have discussed that the orbit is quadrangular pyramid in shape. So the orbit has 4 walls, and anteriorly it has openings. So these openings of the orbit is the base of the orbit. So this is the base. Okay, this is the base, and this base of the orbit is formed by the free orbital margin. Its width is 45 millimeter and height is 35 millimeter. Okay, so this base of the orbit, or this free orbital margin, can be divided into 4 categories based on the anatomical position. This is the superior orbital margin, this is the inferior orbital margin, this is the medial orbital margin, and this is the lateral orbital margin. Okay, so this superior orbital margin is formed by the frontal bone, and you can look out that in the superior orbital margin there is a supraorbital notch. So this supraorbital notch contains the supraorbital artery and nerves, and 10 millimeter medial to this supraorbital notch there is supratrochlear groove, which contains the supratrochlear artery and supratrochlear nerve. Okay, now this inferior free orbital margin is formed mainly by the maxillary bone, also the zygomatic bone. Okay, so this is all about the base of the orbit. Now we will go through the apex of the orbit. So what is the apex of the orbit? So the apex of the orbit is that place or that point where the 4 walls of the orbit or 4 sides of the orbit converge. Okay, so at the apex of the orbit there are 2 foramens. So what is the foramen? Foramen is nothing but it is the hole in the bone. Okay, so there are 2 foramens. The name of the 2 foramens are superior orbital fissure and optic foramen or optic canal. So what is superior orbital fissure? The superior orbital fissure is a comma-shaped area which is formed by the lesser wing of sphenoid bone and greater wing of sphenoid bone. So it is located at the midline of the lesser wing of sphenoid bone above and greater wing of sphenoid bone below. So this is the picture of this sphenoid bone which forms the anterior part of this middle cranial fossa, and this is the lesser wing of sphenoid bone, and this is the greater wing of sphenoid bone, and this is the body of the sphenoid bone. So between this lesser wing and greater wing, this space and this space, these are the superior orbital fissure. Okay, so these are the comma shaped, these are the comma shaped area, and there is a fibrous ring is located between this superior orbital fissure somewhat here, and the name of this fibrous ring is the annulus of Jean, which divides the superior orbital fissure into 3 parts. So these 3 parts are lateral to annulus of Jean, through this annulus of Jean, and medial to annulus of Jean. And through these 3 divisions of the superior orbital fissure, various nerves and arteries are passing through. So in the next slide, we look at what are the structures that are passing through the superior orbital fissure. So you can easily make out that this is the comma-shaped superior orbital fissure, and this bolded, this is the nothing but the annulus of Jean, the fibrous ring. It divides the superior orbital fissure into 3 parts: the lateral, the through the annulus of Jean, and medial. Okay, so from this lateral part, the lacrimal nerve and the frontal nerve is passing through. So this lacrimal nerve and frontal nerve is the branch of the ophthalmic division of trigeminal nerve. The superior ophthalmic vein and the trochlear nerve, which is the 4th cranial nerve, are passing through this lateral to this annulus of Jean through the superior orbital fissure. So these 4, lacrimal nerve, frontal nerve, superior ophthalmic vein, and trochlear nerve, are passing through this lateral to this annulus of Jean through the superior orbital fissure. There are the oculomotor nerves, 3rd and 4th division, the nasociliary nerve, which is the branch of the ophthalmic division of trigeminal nerve, and the 6th cranial nerve, that is the abducens nerve, is passing through this annulus of Jean of the superior orbital fissure. The inferior ophthalmic vein is passing through this medial aspect of this annulus of gene. And what is this annulus of gene basically? So annulus of gene is a fibrous ring, and it is the place from where all the recti muscles are getting originated. So from here it is the lateral rectus muscle, it is the superior rectus muscle, it is the inferior rectus muscle, and this is the medial rectus muscle. Okay. Now it is the second foramen which is located at the apex of the orbit. So this name of the foramen is the optic foramen, also known as the optic canal. So this optic foramen is located at the root of the laser wing of the sphenoid bone. So from this picture you can easily look out that where the optic foramen is located. Look, this is just at the root of the laser wing of the sphenoid. So through this optic foramen, the optic nerve and the ophthalmic artery are passing through. Okay, the orbital end means that end of the optic foramen that looks at the orbit. Orbital end of this optic foramen is circular, and the cranial end of this optic foramen is horizontally oval. Okay, and through this the optic nerve and this ophthalmic artery passes. The ophthalmic artery is a branch of the internal carotid artery, and this optic nerve starts from the retina, and it is the first part of our retinocerebral pathway or visual pathway. Okay, so this is all about the anatomy of orbit. So let's summarize all these things at once. So this is the two bony orbits, its location between the anterior cranial fossa above and the maxillary sinuses below, and the quadrangular pyramid in shape, and it is formed by the seven bone: the frontal bone, lesser wing of sphenoid, greater wing of sphenoid, maxillary bone, the ethmoid bone, lacrimal bone, and zygomatic bone. Okay, and these are the four walls of the orbit. The roof is formed by the frontal bone anteriorly and sphenoid bone posteriorly, mainly the lesser wing of sphenoid. Then this is the lateral wall, which is formed by the zygomatic bone anteriorly and greater wing of sphenoid bone posteriorly. This is the medial wall of orbit, which is formed by this lacrimal bone, ethmoid bone, frontal process of maxillary bone, and body of sphenoid. And this is the floor of the orbit, which is mainly formed by the orbital process of the maxillary bone, and anterolaterally by the zygomatic bone, and posteriorly it is by the palatine bone. Okay, and this is the base of the orbit. So in the base of the orbit is the free margin. Okay, so this is the free margin of the orbit, the superior orbital margin by the frontal bone, the inferior orbital margin, the lateral orbital margin, and this medial orbital margin. Okay, and then the apex of the orbit, it is the point where the four walls of the orbit is converging at a point, and there are two foramen, the superior orbital fissure. So the superior orbital fissure is located in between this lesser wing and greater wing of the sphenoid bone, and sphenoid bone, this is the sphenoid bone, and this is the anterior part of the middle cranial fossa. And so this is the superior orbital fissure, the comma-shaped area, and it is the annulus of gene, and it divides the superior orbital fissure into three parts. Different arteries and nerves pass through the superior orbital fissure at different divisions, at three divisions of the superior orbital fissure. Okay, and last of all, this is the optic foramen. So it is a foramen located at the root of the laser wing, and through this the optic nerve and ophthalmic artery passes. This ophthalmic artery is the branch of the internal carotid artery, and this optic nerve starts from the retina. This optic nerve is the first part of our retinocerebral pathway. And one more thing I would like to include, that among the four walls of the orbit, lateral wall is the thickest wall and medial wall is the thinnest wall. Okay, and that is because the ethmoidal sinusitis, means inflammations to the ethmoidal air sinuses, may cause the orbital cellulitis. Okay, this is all about the anatomy of orbit. So thank you everybody for attending my lecture. Thank you very much.